Okay, we're just starting on the quiz with chapter 13 up to where we are now, before chapter 23. So I have the rhyming ones we've done before up here on the screen with the letter associated with your quiz. So what was chapter 13? Which letter was that? J, yeah. I wasn't going to give it away, although I've mentioned it before. Actually, on this quiz, you could basically not know anything and just about get them all right, because I think all of them mention the first, second, or third journey, beginning or ending or continuing. So context clues, right? Test-taking strategies is what we used to call that in the education world. But chapter 13 begins this first preaching journey, first missionary journey, Paul's first recorded sermon in Antioch. And then chapter 14, it is G, the end of that journey. 10 plus 4, preaching more. But of particular interest, as you see on there, the stoning of Paul at Lystra, which we may reference again in chapter 23. Chapter 15, it is H. This is the one that doesn't fit because it's not one of the journeys. But you got to know that Acts 15 is the council in Jerusalem. What doctrinal issue are they discussing? The circumcision of Gentiles, okay? And so Acts 10 plus 5, settling the strife and determining that, no, Gentiles are not to be required to be circumcised, along with some other things that they write in a letter and send out to the churches. Okay, chapter 16. D, okay, the beginning of the second journey. And particularly Paul and Silas and Timothy in Philippi with Lydia and the Philippian jailer being converted. Chapter 17, yes, F, Thessalonica, run out of town by the Jews. Berea, more noble-minded, searching the scriptures. And then down to Athens in Achaia, where Paul speaks at the Areopagus or Mars Hill there in Acts 17. Acts 18, yes. Acts 18, Paul is in Corinth for 18 months, and that is the end of that second journey. And so then Acts 19. This third journey really bookends with the Ephesian church. Paul spends 3 years in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19, finally run out of town by this mob that gathers over the idols. The silversmiths losing business from the people that Paul's been converting, turning away from idolatry. That makes him leave town, but then in Acts chapter 20, what's that one? C, yes. Paul, after going through Macedonia and Greece and then back again, is on his way to Jerusalem ultimately, but he stops, and much of Acts 20 is devoted to his final meeting with the Ephesian elders, who are very sorrowful over the fact that they will not see Paul again. Then Acts 21. E, we're down to 2 choices here. E, Paul gets to Jerusalem. He attempts to make peace with the Jewish Christians by going to the temple and offering this vow along with a few other Jewish disciples. But the Jews in the temple try to seize Paul. Another mob starts, and he is arrested by the Romans. Remember, as much as anything, just to protect him. Okay, Paul's not necessarily in trouble with the Romans during all of this. They've just arrested him to keep him from getting torn limb from limb. And then Acts chapter 22. Acts 22, Paul's conversion, part 2. They're being dragged away by the Roman guard. Paul addresses this Jewish mob down below, primarily to tell them his story, his Jewish heritage, his past persecution of the Christians, as well as his conversion and seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus. But after that, as we will pick up here in Acts 22, this is the last that I showed you of our chapter summary from that chapter. The end of Paul's defense there on the stairs to the Jewish mob is about the fact that Jesus actually sent him from Jerusalem. Paul had returned to Jerusalem after his conversion, and When you read what Paul says here in Acts 22, it appears as if Paul had this idea that he was going to be the one to convince the Jews to follow Christ, because he himself had opposed the way and then turned and become a believer in Jesus. But Jesus tells him, no, you're not going to do that. They're not going to listen to you. And so I'm going to send you away from Jerusalem to the Gentiles. That was the last thing Paul was able to get out of his mouth, because then in verse 22, hearing this, the Jews become enraged, the mob turns ugly, and once again, Paul is taken by the Roman guard to be kept safe and also to be questioned. And the guard is getting ready to scourge him so that he could get some answers out of him, what's going on with this guy. But Paul reveals that he is in fact a Roman citizen, that is unlawful to treat a citizen in this way. And so he's taken by the Roman commander. We're going to find out later his name is Claudius Lysias. And to set up chapter 23 here, he is being brought before the Jewish council, where he is going to be put on trial, put that in quotes, and the Roman commander wants to kind of see the trial unfold to try to figure out what exactly is going on with this troublemaker. And so that's where we pick up in Acts chapter 23. Let's read it all together, and then as we've been doing, summarize what's going on, and then talk about a few points of interest from this chapter. Acts 23, beginning in verse 1. Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" But the bystanders said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead." As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit. But the Pharisees acknowledged them all. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from there by force and bring him into the barracks. But on that night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, "Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also." When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation, and we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the place." But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks, and he told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter having this form: Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council, and I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but found no other accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he read it, he asked from what province he was, and he learned that he was from Cilicia. He said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Okay, let's go through what happens here in Acts 23, and then you can ask whatever clarifying questions you have. Paul begins in verse 1 seemingly trying to make a defense before these Jews that, again, he probably feels like are his peers to some degree in terms of their shared background. And he emphasizes the fact that he has always lived in good conscience. But instead of hearing him out, Paul was immediately struck across the face, the high priest giving them the command to do that. Paul strikes back. Now, of course, he doesn't use force, but he says in verse 3, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Basically, you say you're doing things according to the law. This is not according to the law. Passages like Deuteronomy 25, that basically says, put someone on trial. If they're innocent, clear them. If they're guilty, beat them. But not before you'd make that determination. Then there's this weird exchange where Paul is rebuked for reviling the high priest of God, and Paul says, I'm sorry, I didn't know he was the high priest. It's hard to know exactly what's going on here. This is speculation with some evidence, but there is a theory that's fairly, widely held that Paul, over the course of his life, developed visual impairment, maybe even to the point of blindness. We mentioned the stoning earlier. You're stoned and left for dead, as we discussed in that class period on Acts 14. Likely there would be some physical ramifications you would live with the rest of your life. In Galatians 4, verse 15, when Paul is stressing to the Galatians how much they had loved him and supported him previously, he says, you would have gladly plucked out your eyes and given them to me. Okay? Why would Paul say that if he's not referring to some physical impairment that he had? Also, at the end of that letter, Paul says, see with what large letters I'm writing my name to you in this greeting. So it could be that because of Paul's visual impairment, he really didn't know, wasn't able to see who it was that had said these things or given the order. Maybe they were all dressed the same, and he had no way of knowing who was the high priest and who wasn't. But he seems to sincerely say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize who this was. Exodus 22:28, he quotes here, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Regardless, Paul clearly knows at this point that this is not going to be a fair trial. And so he tries a different tactic. And he shouts out in the trial that he's a Pharisee and that he's on trial for proclaiming the resurrection of the dead. Well, that is a grenade in the room, because you have the Sadducees who do not believe in resurrection or spirits or angels, and you have Pharisees who do, and so they start arguing amongst themselves. The Pharisees even coming to Paul's defense to some degree, saying, well, maybe a spirit or angel has spoken to him. And so, once again, for his own safety, the Roman commander has Paul taken out of the council and brought into the barracks. Then we're told in verse 11, and this is the first time that Paul has been told this definitively. He's been wanting to go to Rome for a while, but here from the mouth of the Lord he hears that he will, in fact, make it to Rome. And as he has testified to Jesus in Jerusalem, he will testify to Jesus in Rome also. Okay, then we have this plot of the Jews, 40 Jews who say they're not going to eat or drink until Paul is murdered. So, in fact, you can go to Palestine today and you'll find 40 some odd Jews, very hungry, very thirsty, wandering around because they have yet to fulfill their vow. It is Paul's nephew who hears the report of this plot. It's essentially an ambush, right? They say, hey, bring Paul down to be examined one more time. But then they're going to, lie in wait for him and kill him. And so there's several verses here devoted to all of this being explained, from the Jews to the overhearing of Paul's nephew to Paul to then to the commander. But the commander arranges in verse 23 for a military escort. It is one of my life goals to have over 300 armed soldiers escort me from one city to another. You don't think of Paul, this kind of older, visually impaired, itinerant preacher, and here he is with like a full military escort to get down to Caesarea. It's pretty awesome. But with the escort, Claudius Lysias sends a letter, and he explains in the letter, with a little bit of fudging on the details to make himself look more noble than he really is, saying, I saved him from the mob because I knew he was a Roman citizen. Well, no, he didn't know at that point. He found out later. But basically, he's saying to Felix, the governor who is in Caesarea, I don't know what to do with this guy. A lot of trouble seems to be made over him, but I can't find any reason why he would be deserving of death or even imprisonment. So with the letter, the escort takes Paul to Felix, who says he will give Paul a hearing and will ask his accusers to come and present their case as well. And that is Acts 23, and we're left hanging once again for Paul's defense before Felix in chapter 24. But before we get into some discussion, any questions here about the events of Acts chapter 23? Yeah, Brian.
One quick question. Is Ananias the high priest the same high priest?
I guess I don't know. It's probably someone could, verify one or the other. I'm going to guess not, just because of how many years had passed. Also, we learned at the trial of Jesus that there was multiple high priests. There was, as was supposed to be in the law, a high priest that was high priest for life, and that was Annas. And then also in the trials of Jesus, we know that Caiaphas was high priest that year. There was another office that was like the yearly high priest. And that's another, by the way, that's another theory about what happens at the beginning of the chapter, is that because the office of high priest was so corrupt, Paul is actually being sarcastic and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were the high priest, saying you're not actually the high priest, you bought the office, it's corrupt, and your authority is not legitimate before God. So if you like a sarcastic Paul, okay, I see you guys love that. Everyone's like, yes, that's exactly what we wanted. Sarcastic apostle. But go read 2 Corinthians. Paul is very sarcastic in much of his writing, so it would not necessarily be surprising. Steve?
Doesn't Josephus mention him as being very corrupt?
I don't know, does he?
And,
I don't know,
yeah, from a historical standpoint, He was very corrupt. In fact, he stole, if what Josephus says is true, he stole from his own priests. So it may have been that, the apostle recognized, who he was dealing with.
Yeah.
I don't
No,
know.
that's helpful, extra information. Yeah, Timothy.
Just knowing Paul, if I was to speculate, I would speculate that he was saying, in all honesty, I didn't know that he was God's high priest, because he knew that Jesus alone is the high priest.
Oh, I see. So it's yeah. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Robert.
Just a question. Obviously hard to understand how old Paul's nephew is, but how does a centurion or a leader act on a voice of one related person to Paul to take, a military escort down to a new city?
I don't know. I was kind of wondering some of those same things myself in preparing it. It could be related to the fact that, again, the Roman authorities don't seem to see anything too dangerous about Paul. And so maybe they're, more inclined to take the word of, a teenage nephew, and as opposed to some guy who's a real dangerous, criminal, had killed a bunch of people, and his nephew comes along and says, "Hey, let him go because he's, under threat or whatever." But I don't know. It's a good question. Other questions about chapter 23? Okay, well, we got the pump primed a little bit with our discussion about Paul and the high priest. Again, we're looking at imitation of what we're reading in the book of Acts. I will say personally a couple things about this section of Acts that we're in. I was going to say earlier that for me, these last 8 or 9 chapters of Acts are the hardest to kind of keep straight what's going on, right? It's easier to have kind of a, segmented view of each chapter and the main characters, the main places, from, say, chapter 1 through, maybe 17 or 18, right? Obviously, the more you add, the more fuzzy it gets. But when you start in chapter 20 and 21, to Paul coming into Jerusalem, and then the mob in the temple, and then he's arrested, and then he appears before all these different people, speaks to them, it's kind of like one continuous story from that to Rome in chapter 28. And as we've said, the chapter breaks are horrible, because like something will happen, and then he'll say, "And then Paul said to them," next chapter, right? So this is a harder section to kind of keep straight or to remember what exactly is going on from chapter to chapter. It's also, to the point on the screen here, I find these chapters harder than the others to get some real good, meaty application of imitating the disciples, because we're no longer reading about Paul's missionary journeys where he's going and teaching and starting new churches and seeing the Christians interact with each other, or the churches in various places, attending to different needs or answering different questions. We're just seeing these events of Paul's arrest and defenses, and more moving of arrest and more defenses, and moving from one place to the next, shipwrecked, finally getting to Rome. And not that there aren't lessons to be gained from all this, but it's not quite the same to me as some of the other chapters. So, all that being said, as opposed to starting with an open-ended, let's just discuss application points from the chapter, I want to continue on this discussion of Paul before the council and ask you this question. When you look at Acts 23, 1 to 10, and Paul on trial before the Jewish council, is Paul imitating Jesus? And if so, how? I made this point in a previous class that, again, Acts is just Luke part 2. And there are lots of parallels between the way that Luke tells the story of the gospel of Jesus in the book of Luke to the way that Luke tells the story of the first Christians in the book of Acts. Very similar themes, different kind of things that are sounded over and over again throughout each of those books. But also, with Paul, as we said earlier, his story in Acts mirrors very closely the story of Jesus in the book of Luke. About a third of the way into the Gospel of Luke, it says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. And so he's going steadily towards Jerusalem. And he knows, and he says, I know this is God's plan for me to suffer, to be put on trial before the Jewish leaders, to be killed. But I got to go to Jerusalem. I'm determined to go to Jerusalem to fulfill my plan. Then you read the book of Acts, and Paul is basically doing the same thing, right? About halfway through the book, we read that Paul says, I got this plan to go to Jerusalem. Everyone's saying, the Holy Spirit says you're going to suffer, you're going to be bound. It's not good, Paul. And Paul says, nope, I got to go. I'm determined to go. This is God's plan. I got to do it, okay? And so you're reading Paul on this parallel track, kind of following Jesus towards Jerusalem. And we remember the way that Jesus was arrested by the Jewish authorities, right? put up no fight to that. He was put on trial in a very corrupt council that was just looking for any excuse to railroad him through and convict him of death. And famously, Jesus did not really answer a word and endured that false accusation silently and was led to his death on the cross without any objection. Paul, following that same track, gets to Jerusalem, is arrested, put on trial before the council. It's a sham trial. They're trying to railroad him through. And instead of taking it meekly and just going along with what they're going to do, Paul starts, in y'all's mind, making sarcastic comments about the high priest, kind of thumbing his nose at the Jewish council, insulting, dropping these bombs of, I'm a Pharisee, y'all fight over it, and getting out of the trial, essentially, during that uproar. So, what do we make of all that? From the standpoint of Paul, in the story that Luke is telling, imitating Jesus, and if that's going on, how we see that going on. So, talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes and kind of generate some ideas, and we'll share them out. But this is the question. How in this trial in Acts 23, the first 10 verses, how is it that Paul is imitating Jesus, his master, before the Jewish council? Go. Okay, let's share out what we think about this. And I do think HE is here to, if this goes the wrong way, I can be rescued out of here, grabbed and pulled out of the angry mob, depending on how the discussion turns. Yeah, oh yeah. Okay, what do you want to say about Paul's imitation of Christ before the Jewish council in Acts 23 here? Truth, kick us off here.
This actually may also be a grenade, but just another question to ask. We did mention in chapter 22 that is there a possibility of Paul doing the wrong thing, right? And of course, Paul is imperfect, and so I don't have an answer to this question exactly, but does it have to be that Paul is doing the right thing in this scenario? Is Luke intending us to necessarily follow Paul's example in this case? I'm not sure, but just posing the question.
No, it's a good question. It's part of the reason why I phrased the question as I did. I'm not necessarily assuming that we think he is imitating Jesus. So that's kind of the first question. Is he? If so, how? So, yeah, that's up for questioning as well, whether he is doing the right thing, handling this in the right way, or not. Who are we pointing at, Robert? Oh, Ian, go ahead, and then Brian.
Sure. I don't know if this is exactly true, but I think you can possibly see here that Paul is imitating Christ in the way that he's responding to the comments, to the actions of the Pharisees and Sadducees by just quoting Scripture, by correcting them in the law that they should know, by pointing out that you're not obeying the law or you're twisting the law in some form or fashion. And that is exactly what Jesus did. So he clearly learned that skill from Jesus, right? It's kind of a middle of the road way to deal with tension without stirring up too much trouble.
Sure. Okay. So imitating Jesus as Jesus did, using Scripture against the people who should have known it, right, to rebuke them and to correct them. Thank you, Ian. Brian?
Yeah. I would just say as a broad template is that there's a lot of parallels between every Christian who are the other sons of God with the Son of God and the things that happen in our life, from being baptized to being persecuted to suffering and so forth. But in this instance, I can see the parallel that, number one, Paul is preaching the resurrection, just as Jesus preached the resurrection. And in other epistles, of course, he preaches his own resurrection, of which is true of all Christians. And secondly, we see that Paul, looking, and I can't cite the verse in the earlier chapters of Acts, where he says, I'm prepared to die. I'm going to Jerusalem, and yes, I could be killed, and that's what I intended. I would be gladly die for the cause of Christ.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. So we have the proclamation of the resurrection. We also have, from Paul's earlier statements in Acts, that he's not necessarily avoiding death or wanting to avoid death. He's clearly willing to face whatever fate arises. Albert? Not quite yet.
Okay, good.
I mean, it depends on
I
how
like
long you
being the
talk,
last word
but
guy.
if you talk for 8 minutes, then cutting you off.
And agree, we talked about his persistence and carrying on, even knowing what ultimately was coming once he hit the land of Rome. But just his persistence, but also I see great constraint because we have examples. Paul was quick-tempered and violent in action, and when he thought he was in the right, pursuing those who were of the way before he became aware of it, very aggressive and all. And, Jesus, we have examples of brood of vipers, and we turning over the table in the temple. So Jesus had constraint, and I'm not saying Jesus sinned or anything, in no way, but you just see constraint and persistence to carry on all the way through Rome, even though he knew what the conclusion would be. And I just think about when he left the people earlier on the land and they prayed, and even though they knew they believed the truth, they were believers, great example did it show those people that, wow, Paul knows the outcome, but he loves God so much and believes that Jesus is the Christ and the Savior, that he's still willing to go. How strengthened were those folks by his determination?
No, thank you, Albert. Persistence, determination, regardless of what he's going to face. Other ideas? I keep seeing Robert's hand, but I don't know if he's actually going to say something. Timothy?
Yeah, if we have any question to whether or not he was imitating Jesus, I think it's all removed with verse 11. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." And so this, to me, is absolute commendation, and you did exactly what I wanted you to do, and I want you to do it again at Rome.
Yeah. Thank you, Timothy. Robert?
Yeah, this is definitely, if you compare to the later part of Jesus' teaching, we're way past the discussion, sitting in the Sanhedrin and talking and trying to educate. This is in the we want to kill you, and we're going to do it in any way. So when you look at that perspective, and I think Nick mentioned it as well, this is his ticket to Jerusalem as a Roman citizen, to Rome as a Roman citizen, as opposed to his current status, which is a Jew of the Jews.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. And then Michael?
So,
not quite last
to
word, but
piggyback
we're getting
that,
close.
I was thinking that he was not imitating Christ, and that it's just very different. I mean, the one similarity, not the one, but one similarity is if he wasn't being sarcastic when he was talking to them, he was acknowledging their authority, their God-given, God gave him authority as a high priest, and Jesus acknowledged that with Pilate. But aside from that, Jesus knew that was the end. He knew it, and he was facing it, and it's different in that way, especially if in chapter 19 it mentions, like he talks about going to Rome, and in that same verse he talks about the Spirit. I had it pulled up, but I cannot quote it. But it leads me to the conclusion that he knew that there was going to be something else beyond this trial.
No, thank you, Michael. All right, as usual, y'all have rendered me superfluous by saying most everything that I was going to bring to the discussion. I do think this larger purpose is a factor here, and we've talked about both sides. We've talked about the fact that Jesus clearly had his purpose of becoming the sacrificial lamb in Jerusalem, and everything was building up towards that, and he was pulling all the strings to make that happen. To Michael's point, Paul, it's open-ended. He doesn't have that kind of certainty about this is the way it has to end. Also, as several of you mentioned, he has this goal of trying to get to Rome, and you have to think that that is coloring everything that he is doing. And so what he's doing here is playing into his, he's trying to work it to fulfill his ultimate purpose, okay? He does, it seems in verse 1, try to make his defense, right? Again, something different than what Jesus was trying to do. Jesus had, to Robert's point, had thorough discussions with the scribes and Pharisees, so by the time he gets there on that Thursday night in that Jewish trial, he's not trying to persuade them. Paul, however, has come back to Jerusalem and is really trying to talk some sense into these Jews, at least at first. And so he begins making his defense that way. But, as we have said, it's quickly apparent that they don't want to have anything to do with that. Like Jesus, it is a sham trial, and they are railroading him. From this point, again, it depends on your interpretation. We've had basically kind of three options that I'll let you pick from for what is going on in this scene. One option that I suggested was Paul literally couldn't tell visually who was the high priest, and so that's why this happens. And once he realizes it, says, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." The second option was that he was being sarcastic to rebuke the high priest and highlighting his corruption. The third option, which Timothy gave us, was that it's basically a way of saying there is no high priest but Jesus anymore. And so he's proclaiming that. Obviously, which of those doors you choose would color the way that you read this story, okay? But if we're thinking that Jesus is rebuking the leaders here, that should be no surprise if you've read the Gospels. Jesus used the same language of a whitewashed tomb to rebuke the scribes and the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. And Paul does the same thing here. So that is itself an imitation of Jesus, speaking the truth, using, as Ian said, the law to rebuke those who were experts in the law and to call them out for their hypocrisy. And again, depending on your interpretation, it does appear as if Paul respects the authority that was given. I hadn't thought about the parallel to Pilate that Michael brought up, but that's a good one. Paul does, in the end, go along. He's not trying to bust out. He's not trying to overthrow. He's not trying to subvert anything. He does ultimately respect their authority, but he does use his cleverness and strategy to escape from this sham of a trial towards the future goal. And Timothy brought up the critical verse 11, that after all of this, Jesus says, "This is exactly what I want you to do, Paul." And he has this larger purpose of getting to Rome to testify there that he is going to fulfill. And if you look back at the life of Jesus, there were instances like in Nazareth in Luke 4 where Jesus was about to be killed, and yet he said, "Nope, not my time. I got other things to do." And so he found his way out of those situations to continue on with the work that he was trying to do. So if anything, it's an interesting case study in the fact that imitation of Jesus doesn't always look the exact same way. We can imitate Jesus in different ways, and the circumstances look different, but in the end, the goal is the same, which is to reflect his nature, his character, and to proclaim his gospel and shine his light. Okay, that was the discussion question. We'll summarize 23 and Rick will pick up in 24 and 25 on Sunday. Thank you, guys. That was fun.